Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Above Olympus, Domesday. Imperator Caesar, son of God. By 1086. All revolt against the Norman invaders had been crushed. The iron grip of military occupation had lodged itself over the nation in what would become a permanent English class institution. The Norman question of English history had been given an authoritative, historical answer. 1086 was the year that the Normans led an almost systematic survey of the spoils of their conquest. The findings of the survey were collected into a book so that native English assets could be accounted for and taxed accordingly. In the 1170s, Treasurer Richard Fitznigel wrote in the Dialogue Concerning the Exchequer, "This book is metaphorically called by the native English Doomsday, that is, the Day of Judgment. For just as the verdict of that strict and terrible last account cannot be evaded by any skillful subterfuge, so when this book is appealed to on those matters which it contains, its sentence cannot be quashed or set aside with impunity. That is why the book is called the Book of Judgment, Doomsday Book, not because it contains judgments on various difficult questions, but because its decisions, like those of the Last Judgment, are unalterable." Doomsday implied the imposition of a verdict from which there was no appeal. It implied that William behaved as if he was God. The conquest had been blessed by the Pope and, reigning upon this authority, William's will appeared to many as the will of God. But to others, the decrees of William the Conqueror may have seemed to transcend the decrees of God. Did the Normans usurp not only highest political verdict, but even the verdict of God? Was there no higher judgment? The behavior of these Norman masters resembled, not God, but the Olympian gods of pagan mythology. William and his Normans acted like Zeus and the Greek gods, a divine aristocracy pronouncing judgments from the heights of Mount Olympus. A pagan god, after all, was not a purely mythological concept, but one that could be applied to humans who embodied the highest excellences. According to Aristotle's Politics, if there exists in a state an individual so preeminent in virtue that neither the virtue nor the political capacity of all the other citizens is comparable with his, such a man should be rated as a god among men. Virtue, here, refers not to self-debasing humility of a Christian, but the manly excellence of a pagan, especially when executed in political life. Both the Old Testament of Greece's Homer and the New Testament of Rome's Virgil presented models of virtuous heroes, gods, and a divine mythology that justified war and warrior. 1318 in Virgil's Aeneid, for example, Jupiter, the king of the gods, gives divine sanction for Roman world domination. "For these I set no bounds in space or time, but have given empire without end. The Romans, lords of the world, and the nation of the toga. Thus it is decreed." 1319, I.278-83. Res Gesti Divi Augusti, the acts of the divine Augustus accordingly celebrated the deeds, by which he brought the whole earth under the empire, imperium of the Roman people. 1320 For the Roman poet Ovid, Caesar Augustus was Jupiter, king of the gods. Gods, after all, run the world, and Caesar ran the world, so Roman Caesars must therefore be gods. 1321 In Roman-occupied Israel, this divinization of Caesar was a direct provocation to its monotheistic beliefs. "Only God, not Caesar, is Lord," wrote John Dominic Crossan, and to submit to a census for taxation is to accept Rome as God's replacement. 1322 Would Caesar be allowed to cast final judgment upon Israel? There was a human being in the 1st century who was called Divine, Son of God, God, and God from God, whose titles were Lord, Redeemer, Liberator, and Savior of the world. Who was that person? Most people who know the Western tradition would probably answer, unless alerted by the question's too obviousness, Jesus of Nazareth. And most Christians probably think that those titles were originally created and uniquely applied to Christ. But before Jesus ever existed, All those terms belong to Caesar the Augustus to proclaim them of Jesus the Christ was thereby to deny them of Caesar the Augustus. They were taking the identity of the Roman emperor and giving it to a Jewish peasant. Either that was a peculiar joke and a low lampoon, or it was what the Romans called majestas and we call high treason. 1323. Just as Jesus usurped Caesar's authority in a world where Rome ruled, the Bible provided a license for high treason in a world where Norman ruled. William the Conqueror was almost like a medieval Caesar who attempted to dress pagan values in a Christian garb. The seemingly unalterable Domesday judgments that William the Conqueror had pronounced upon the Anglo-Saxon nation would have their own judgment day. King Charles I, beheaded in the Puritan Revolution in 1649, was a hereditary descendant of William the Conqueror. The Puritan Revolution was high treason against the divine right of kings, and a revocation of William the Conqueror's hereditary usurpation of a godlike judgment upon Anglo-Saxon history. In America, the basic themes of the English Civil War were reborn in the American Civil War. While the Normans of the South became the central slave owners in revival of the rule of biology, the Anglo-Saxons of the North countered with the rise of economic technology. Two opposite directions in history confronted one another. The Norman aristocracy of the South believed in the rule of superior humans, while the North focused on economic technological development over hereditary development. By relinquishing hereditary rule and formal principle, the Puritan Yankee North was effectually preparing the beginning of end of the rule of biology that, through victory in that war, came to be symbolized as Americanism. Put another way, the Anglo-Saxon Puritan Yankees in America ultimately reacted to their post-1066 death as a nation through resurrection as post-biological nation. The new techno-eugenics may open the door, not necessarily to a new, master race, but to genetically engineered gods. Non-biological technological evolution may open the door to the possibility of artificial intelligence that fulfills the role of God. When gods such as Caesar or William the Conqueror attempted to usurp the supremacy of God, they also set in motion the seeds of their own demise. The ultimate incompatibility of biologically based evolution and technologically based evolution may set in motion the old war between the gods and God, because this conflict has really symbolized a fundamentally evolutionary struggle. From the very beginning, genetically engineered humans who define themselves as transhuman or post-human are leaving behind the basis for human solidarity as humans and abandoning their humanity. They may either reject solidarity with humans or be rejected by humanists. Genetically engineered humans who are designed to be superior to other humans may understand the specific genetic basis of specific kinds of superiority over humans. This is not the best formula for political equality with humans. There does appear to be a scientific basis for an ultimate clash of good and evil. Good correlates with transcending the selfish genes, while evil correlates with obeying the selfish genes. As new genetic and technological means of human enhancement are developed, not everyone will be equally willing to reinvent themselves. Only a distinct minority of humans will embrace the leaps of evolutionary possibility at the cutting edge. There are many possibilities here: genetic enhancements, technological enhancement, and various combinations of both. Ultimately, however, it is technology, not biology, that will lead the evolutionary future. Even with the best efforts to mix the fates of biology and technology, a point will eventually come when the political interests of cutting-edge biology and the political interests of cutting-edge technology collide. And this could mean a clash of the gods and God. Gods are primarily biological transhumans or post-humans, and some may choose to value biology as a cause. God is the cutting edge of post-biological evolution. If those at the cutting edge of biological and post-biological evolution leave most people behind, whom will the people support? Supporting the gods means supporting biological beings that may be so superior in capabilities that all pretense of equality is shattered. Only some form of aristocracy is conceivable, even if they lead with the support of the people. An algod that emerges as machines displace human workers, and is in a greater position to control the economy, has a basis for forming an unprecedented egalitarianism in human society. As automated machines take over human work, the possibilities of greater economic equality among people will open. Some will likely oppose the new equality, not unlike the way that the Nazis fought for the supremacy of biology. Although genetic engineering opens possibilities beyond Christ killers like the Nazis, the basic issues of human inequality remain. When it becomes clear that biology is in decline, there may be a revolt of the genes. Who will control the future? I have not attempted to compare to all combinations of all possible scenarios. Although the scenarios presented here are very much oversimplified, it is nonetheless increasingly clear that the logic of biological evolution stands in ultimate conflict with the logic of technological evolution. There is thus the possibility of an ultimate conflict between the rule of biology and the rule of technology, a battle between the genocracy of Caesar and the tachdom of God. On one hand, it is possible that most humans will be able to transcend biology by joining God AI in a digital heaven. Those who return to the cause of Caesar, Hitler, and the gods, on the other hand, may foment nothing less than Armageddon. Chapter Break. Tolerance for greater economic inequality, greater genetic inequality, and other forms of diversity. If there is one thing that James Hughes' Citizen Cyborg helps to clarify, it is that the liberal democratic age is coming to an end. It makes no difference whether it is the new genetic enhancement technologies, artificial intelligence, or both. This old order will not be able to withstand the new and unprecedented inequalities that new technologies will be able to bring about. The evolutionary moderation that has made liberal democracy practicable cannot hold together the new extremes that are on the horizon. James Hughes wants to make the world safe for middle-class Übermenschen. Book argues that transhuman technologies that push the boundaries of humanness, can radically improve our quality of life, and that we have a fundamental right to use them to control our bodies and minds. But to ensure these benefits we need democratically regulate these technologies and make them equally available in free societies. Becoming more than human can improve all our lives, but only new forms of transhuman citizenship and democracy will make us freer, more equal and more united. 1324. Hughes's views are derivative of a tradition of rights. But can transhumanism be contained within this all-too-human notion of rights? Hughes' book raises the question of whether the liberal democratic idea of rights is becoming obsolete. After all, the original idea was human rights. There is no reason to think that this old idea will still be valid in a realm that plainly goes beyond the scope of its original human conception. The idea of radicalizing human right to accommodate unprecedented technologies may be like the attempt to radicalize the idea of the divine right of kings to accommodate the changes of early modernity. Can the evolutionary assumptions of transhumanism be reconciled with the original scientific understanding upon which liberal democracy was based? A basic assumption upon which Thomas Jefferson's political Weltanschauung stood was the eternal pre-existence of God, and his creation of the world. 1325. He rejected the relatively evolutionary hypothesis of a creator who first made a chaotic lump and set it into rotatory motion, and then waited the millions of ages necessary to form itself. The geological evidence that supported this view was inconsistent with his understanding of nature's creator. We may as well suppose he created the earth at once, nearly in the state in which we see it, fit for the preservation of the beings he placed on it. 1326. What did the American founders think of the political implications of evolution by natural selection? Answer: they were utterly ignorant of Darwin's future discovery. This is why biblical explanations of human creation could appear as feasible as many others. Since they were ignorant of evolution, the founders of liberal democracy did not and could not fully anticipate the practical possibilities of genetic re-engineering and techno-eugenics. Such founders cannot be considered reliable guides to technologies that can produce new, post-human species. Is it possible to overrun human boundaries towards non-human animals on one hand, and towards post-humans on the other, without overrunning the boundaries of rights? Rights are an all-too-human idea, not a transhuman idea. Hughes, however, seemed to believe that the idea of rights can stay the same even if everything else changes. Transhumanists extend the liberal democratic humanist tradition to a defense of our right to control our own bodies and minds. even if our choices make us something other than human. Transhumanists believe liberal democracy can and must accommodate the post-humans that will be created by genetic and cybernetic technologies. 1327. The facile application of traditional individual choice to these issues neglects recognition that liberal democracy reigns in precisely the boundaries that transhumanism aims to overrun. It was simply not previously possible to choose to leave the human species on a genetically designed basis. Just as new biotechnologies invalidate traditional limits of the human, appeals to traditional arguments for liberty and privacy cannot be assumed applicable to these novel scenarios. The idea of human rights preceded the discovery of biological evolution. The idea that people have a right to control their own genome. 1328. With previously non-existent technologies is a right that cannot be neatly added to the old liberal democratic tradition. Procreative freedom stabs at the heart of liberal democracy because it is the freedom to deny its tabula rasa premises. The right to change one's genome is the right to refute the tabula rasa, Lockean assumptions that were an original basis of human rights. Genetic enhancement almost amounts to a form of treason against the Lockean clean slate. Liberal democratic techno-eugenics rips at the very foundation of the tradition it attempts to build upon. Perhaps the most practical basis of liberal democracy's tabula rasa was an acceptance of an unchanging range of human abilities. It was because humans have hitherto been incapable of changing their heredity makeup that the best one could do was to focus on non-biological change. If there was a broad, empirical meaning to human equality, it was not that all humans are equal in their capacities, it was the assumption of a range of characteristics that made it meaningful to use the word human. Equality meant that pretensions to aristocracy were really inside those limits, and not outside those limits. A distinctive possibility of the new techno-eugenics is precisely the ability to surmount the limits of the human. Every step of biological eugenic progress that not only affirms, but increases genetic inequality, is like an axe that hacks at the foundation of liberal democracy. The new biotechnologies may make the assumptions underlying liberal democracy obsolete. An implication of redesigning individual constitutions is redesigning political constitutions. The aims of transhumanism advertently or inadvertently increase the foundations of human inequality. It is a theoretical end of liberal democracy that techno-eugenicists plan to put into practice. Transhumanism, almost by definition, is built with an inherent tendency towards freedom from responsibility to humanity. Among the possibilities presented by the new biotechnologies is the ability to alter the genes of a chimpanzee so that it possesses average human intelligence. This breaks a species divide, just as post-humanity would break a species divide. But the new question raised here is not whether chimpanzees should be granted the right to live, but whether chimpanzees should be given the right to vote or to run for political office. Will humans become the chimpanzees of the future? Critics from the left worry that if intelligence amplification is available on the market, it will exacerbate social inequality. And they are right. Securing our rights to become the most that we can be will require not only a fight for our individual rights to use technology to control our own brains, but also a fight to ensure universal access to intelligence-amplifying technology. 1329. If wholesale bans are put in place, the most likely practical result is that new technologies will be available only to the wealthy. Without bans, the wealthy will still be in position to exacerbate their economic advantage with new biological advantages. For this reason, Hughes suggested that the government subsidize eugenic programs for the lower and middle classes. 1330. The bottom line is that the net result of an attempt to create a transhuman liberal democracy will be an unprecedented increase of inequalities of all kinds. Many, if not most, people will be resistant to altering the nature of their children for ethical, traditional, or religious reasons. Those who are not resistant to viewing their children as weapons in a genetic arms race, on the other hand, may begin a pattern in which the inclination to genetic self-manipulation is passed on genetically. Biological advantage multiplied by biological advantage will quickly distance the most aggressive self-enhancers from everyone else. Even with a generous subsidy program, The net result will be an increase in genetic inequality. That genetic accelerating returns will continue to increase ever more aggressively. The only way to enforce a universal attempt to overcome the biological basis of human inequality would be a distinctly communist-like totalitarian state that would force people to control their reproduction in ways that ensure a biologically equal society. Hughes countered the problem of authoritarianism with an attempt to make radical individual liberty a core principle, and to derive the need for equality and public provision from the need to maximize individual potential. 1331 Equality cannot be derived from liberty. Equality counters liberty, and cannot be derived from liberty. The more that liberty is granted at the expense of equality, the more biological inequality is likely to increase. Hughes blames libertarian groups such as extropians, and their refusal to be limited by egalitarian or social concerns, for diminishing the popularity and influence of the early techno-eugenic or transhuman movement. 1332 But libertarians are right to see equality as a threat to their personal self-enhancement. 1333 This kind of libertarianism, the liberty to increase the biological foundations of human inequality, breaks the balance of liberty and equality that has made liberal democracy viable. This kind of libertarianism breaks the foundations of liberal democracy itself. No matter which way one looks at it, Hughes' formula for progress is the increase of hereditary inequality. When hereditary inequality advances to the point where there is a genuine genetic divide between humans and post-humans, will there be conflict or solidarity? Hughes suggests that one way in which solidarity can overcome conflict is by making societies highly tolerant of diversity. 1334 It should be kept in mind that the very idea of multiculturalism and its correlate, the celebration of diversity, represents the failure or the limitations of an original liberalism that supposed that legal rights could be a sufficient framework for encompassing the order of the human. In other words, belief in the group principle of multiculturalism already represents some level of disbelief and abandonment of the idea of individual rights. The conflict between individual rights and Islamic Sharia law in Europe is perfect illustration of this foundational conflict. What Hughes is doing is taking this postmodern abuse of the idea of rights, and subtly accepting this weakened foundation as license for an even further transhumanist abuse. Kites, however, assume some basis of common unity. The use of one breakdown in the legitimacy of rights to help justify another breakdown in the legitimacy of rights will likely result in a de facto collapse of a working system of common rights. Why, after all, do the ruling classes of the West appear to be so accepting of this idea of multiculturalism? Among the many reasons for this, is that economic inequality can be viewed as a form of diversity. Diversity implies some form inequality in the form of difference, and multiculturalism's weakening of the rule of equal rights among individuals promotes a weakening of the rule of equality generally. Economic inequality can be viewed not as an abuse of wealth distribution among individuals, but as a part of the marvelous diversity of the world, and perhaps even the diversity of notions of justice. Ultimately, the corporation appropriates the multicultural notion of group rights to extend the rule of the rich from notions of diversity that promote tolerance for the increase of economic inequality. Hughes sees progress towards ideas that promote tolerance for the increase of genetic inequality. Just as conflict among economic classes can be assuaged by viewing economic inequality as a wonderful form of diversity, perhaps conflict between humans and post-humans can be assuaged by viewing the increase of genetic inequality as an even more wonderful form of diversity. Is this what progress means? After 400 years of democratic citizenship gradually being extended to include working men, women and all races, transhumanists argue that rights should now be extended to all self-aware minds. 1335 Hughes proposed that the ground of rights be personhood, cyborg citizenship, a self-aware mind. Humans without self-aware minds are not persons, and persons need not be human. This implies that non-biological self-aware minds such as artificial intelligences might benefit the most from these new boundaries. While progressive optimism based on belief in liberation from nature implicates both genetic and non-genetic technologies, Not everyone is equally optimistic about both. Looking just at techno-optimism. The constituencies that feel positive about human reproductive and genetics technology tend to also feel optimistic about the space program, nanotechnology and other technologies. The reverse is not always the case though. More Americans are optimistic about the benefits of non-genetic technologies, such as space and computing, than genetics. In other words, attitudes towards genetic and reproductive technology are a more sensitive barometer of someone's techno-optimism. If you are optimistic about genetics, you have put future shock behind you. 1336. False. It is not quite true that those who are optimistic about genetics are equally optimistic about non-genetic technologies. Hughes himself proves this point. Citizen Cyborg is wrongly named. The book is overwhelmingly concerned with post-human biological species. Cyborg citizenship deals with regulated genetic enhancements and moderate cyborg integration. Yet the completion of the cyborg trajectory seems to falter at the prospect of giving rights to artificial intelligences. Our obligation to acknowledge self-aware machines will need to be balanced by our obligation to protect the interests of already existing organic citizens. His policies would ensure that machine minds either do not achieve self-awareness, or achieve only a safe level of powers with inbuilt solidarity for the rest of their fellow citizens. Hughes looks at the prospect of artificial intelligence the same way as most people look at the prospect of genetic post-humans. What is most remarkable about this resistance to artificial intelligence citizenship is that machines would be the greatest beneficiaries of his reformulation of rights based on personhood. Personhood opposed human racism, or the belief that citizenship and rights have something to do with simply having a human genome. 1337. Personhood could one day become the legal basis for uploading humans into digital form. He seems to have set up personhood only to knock down its most significant implications in the name of a bioluddism of the most fundamental kind. In short, Hughes wants to discriminate against God. Hughes claimed that biopolitics will be the arena of 21st century controversy. At one end of the biopolitical spectrum are the bioluddites, defending humanity from enhancement technologies, and at the other the transhumanists, advocating for our right to become more than human. 1338. Since biopolitics is basically contained within the scope of biology, and Hughes resists the inclusion of pure machine self-aware minds, is there a basis for a schism within the transhumanist movement? The biophysicist and biotech entrepreneur Gregory Stock raised the larger issue here. The ultimate question of our era is whether the cutting edge of life is destined to shift from its present biological substrate to that of silicon and its ilks. 1339. He perceives some degree of competition between the old biological paradigm and the new. In a sense, germline manipulation is biology's bid to keep pace with the rapid evolution of computer technology. 1340. These biotechnologies, however, did not come about because a genetic mutation allowed some individual the unprecedented ability to read and alter her own genetic code. That breakthroughs in genetic engineering were made possible by computer-based technologies exemplifies the power of post-biological evolution. Although an enthusiastic proponent of genetic enhancement, Stock himself was less than enthusiastic about the prospect of switching to a post-biological substrate. Predictions of the imminent fusion of human and machine ignored the degree to which we are biological in nature and want to remain that way. 1341. This preference for biological forms was not based on pessimism about the growth prospects of non-genetic technologies. If non-biological complexity continues to grow exponentially, eventually it will transcend biology. 1342. A classic case of how computer technologies are making biology irrelevant is represented by computer simulations of genetically engineered organisms. In order to ensure that a genetically engineered human would not carry harmful or painful structural errors, computer simulations could test how the genomes would unfold. Yet if one can simulate biology on a computer at a fraction of the time, and with all the possibilities of technological enhancement, why even bother with actual biology at all? Hughes is rightly concerned that self-aware machines may be so different from biological species that there is a legitimate question of mental solidarity between machines and humans. But the larger question here is whether it is artificial intelligence, or techno-eugenics, that completes the evolutionary trajectory of liberal democracy. Is it true that technological advances that question conventional biological borders will force our society in the coming decades to complete the trajectory of 400 years of liberal democracy and choose what Hughes calls cyborg citizenship? 1343. Hughes offers no scientific basis for the old idea of rights except for tradition. This is the deepest flaw of his perspective. Hughes does not recognize that the values behind human rights and its distinctive egalitarian trajectory are founded upon direct opposition to biological evolution by natural selection. Far from being random products of subjective human imagination, the foundation of human rights, the universal right to life, implies the engineered end of evolution by natural selection. Progressive egalitarianism is the logical extension of the system of rights, the system that progressively ends biological evolution while progressively advancing economic technological evolution. The political right, then, is correlated with biological evolution, while the political left is correlated with post-biological evolution. While it is entirely correct to recognize that genetic engineering represents possibilities of biological evolution that transcend natural selection, it is also easy to miss the larger picture. The ability to manipulate the human genome is made possible by advances in non-biological evolution, and the capabilities of post-biological evolution are on course to overtake genetically enhanced humans. Biotechnologies are parts of a larger evolutionary transition from biology to technology. The most distinctive assumption of liberal democracy is the loci tabula rasa. The ability to alter one's genome is the most blatant refutation of this assumption. Capitalism-driven, non-genetic technological evolution, however, is the forte of liberal democracy. The primacy of post-biological evolution is the deeper meaning of the tabula rasa, a point exemplified by the example of American founder and inventor Benjamin Franklin. The pinnacle of non-biological technological evolution would be artificial intelligence, and this development completes the trajectory of liberal democracy.